to Soul Food Coffee House in Redmond, Washington for Astrology Night. This is the astrology forecast for March of 2017. And we have a very interesting month ahead of us. Actually, for the record, because we record on the last Wednesday of every month, this is February 22nd. And so we have a whole week of a very short month ahead of us still. And I must say, although I did say this last month when I recorded in January for February, I must say that if you think things are crazy, and I know I've said this a few times over the past 4 or 5 months. In fact, I remember saying this last August, and then in September, and then again in October, and then certainly in November. And I'm saying it again now. If you think things have been crazy, well, we're in for a little bit of a spin over the next week. And this is a shorter frame craziness. And I'm going to back up and we're going to talk about March in just a few moments. But I want to point out that on Sunday, the 26th, we have a solar eclipse on the same day that Mars, the planet of war, the planet of anger, is joined up with Uranus, the planet of shock, craziness, and surprise. Now today, on the 22nd, we have Mars squaring Pluto. And Mars squaring Pluto is a rather nasty astrological neighborhood, because again, Mars is the planet of war, and Pluto is the planet of hidden power. It's the planet of transformation and stuff going on beneath the surface. And for any of you who are paying attention to what's going on, you know that we have the finality, or at least a current round of finality, of a show of power at Standing Rock. And it's not pretty what has gone on, and it probably won't be pretty what goes on later tonight and tomorrow. And this is certainly tied to Mars squaring Pluto. But you know, we're coming off of several years of Uranus, the planet of revolution, squaring Pluto, the planet of evolution. And this week, today through the weekend, Mars is lining up with a square to Pluto. Mars is in Aries, squaring Pluto today, and then moving to join up with Uranus during the solar eclipse on Sunday. So I think we have some rock and roll in front of us yet. All right. Before I jump into March, I do want to mention a couple of things coming up for people on the internet. These are not local events, but on March 25th, I will be at the San Francisco Bay Astrology Group, the NCGR, that's the National Council for Geocosmic Research. That's the conference that I just spoke in Baltimore just this last weekend. But the local San Francisco group will be meeting on March 25th in San Francisco at Fort Mason. You can find more information on the internet. I will be there. Then on Sunday, the following day, the 26th, I will be doing a similar workshop on doing better chart readings, and that'll be for the Sacramento group. So that's March 25th and 26th. Then, and I've mentioned this before, but now it's time to either do it or let it pass, because the rooms are filling up and this conference will fill up. And the week of May 6th through May 13th, I will be one of a handful of astrologers that will be teaching at a conference called Astrology Rising, Co-Creating the Future. And this will be in Guanacaste, Costa Rica, on the beach. The resort we're staying at is gorgeous. It is actually on the beach on the Pacific Ocean side, and it will be a week-long conference. For any of you who have listened to the Pele Report, a weekly astrology report with Kai Pacha, he is actually the host of this conference. There'll be many other amazing astrologers there, including Maurice Fernandez, Patricia Walsh, and the conference will be very much oriented toward experiential There will be yoga and movement and dance, and amongst the other things, I'll be doing a couple of lectures there, but I'll also be doing a large-scale astrodrama of Kaipacha's chart, which means that I will pick different people to play the role of each of his planets, and he will stand in the middle of his chart, and we will enact his chart around him. This work is very transformative and very exciting. So that's in May 6th through the 13th, astrologyrisingcostarica.com. The annual Seattle conference, probably the most fun and probably the best of all the regional conferences, NORWAC, the Northwest Astrology Conference, every year, Memorial Day weekend, at the Doubletree down at South Center near SeaTac, down near the airport. More information online at norwac.net. It's an amazing conference. You can go for a day or the weekend, but there will be astrologers lecturing from all over the world. Brian Clark from Tasmania will be there. There will be astrologers from Europe, from the UK, from the United States, from Mexico, from Canada, and it'll be quite an event, and I will see you there, hopefully. Last thing to put on your calendar is I will be doing a mini version of what I did in India at Brighton Bush Hot Springs this summer, July 31st through August 2nd. And I've spoken a lot over the years about how awesome Brighton Bush is. I'm not going to say a bunch about it now. I do have some catalogs here that have the entire summer schedule and a little more information about my workshop. And there's time to register for that. But if you're thinking about Costa Rica, those rooms are filling up. The hotel is going to sell out. There'll be about 120 people at this gathering. It's going to be a party. All right, enough of that. Let's get into it. March. So, this has been a rather crazy year, and some of its craziness has been very predictable. And even though when craziness occurs, part of craziness is not knowing how it will occur. In fact, there's a saying in astrology that Uranus makes things that are unpredictable happen. So how do you predict something that's unpredictable? You know, it's like when lightning strikes. If there's a storm, you can know that there's thunder and lightning, and you know that lightning is striking, but you don't know where it's going to strike, and you don't know exactly when. And although the Uranus-Pluto square, Uranus, the planet of shock and surprise and awe, and Pluto, the planet of intense transformation, metamorphosis, change. Pluto is the process by which a caterpillar becomes a butterfly. It's a deep and powerful one-way change. It's not like the leaves falling off the tree every year. Pluto is a much deeper and more powerful and profound change. So Uranus and Pluto were lined up in the mid-60s that created the upheaval of the 60s. The sex, drugs, and rock and roll, the gender issues, the rise of feminism, or the second wave of feminism. It was ecology, it was people marching in the streets, civil rights. It was also, at the tail end of it, it was the repression of the Nixon era coming in after student revolutions and all of that. Well, we are in a similar phase right now, and we're in this process with these same two planets, but this time 90 degrees to each other. There's a lot of stress and tension and conflict between these energies, and we're seeing this play out. We saw it begin back around the Arab Spring and the Occupy Wall Street, and it really hasn't settled down. And what we're seeing in politics right now as a backlash to that, and what we're seeing on the streets in the United States as a backlash to the backlash, is that possible? I guess. is all part of this process. And I know I've said this before, but even though Uranus moves faster than Pluto, and you can see it's at a higher degree. Uranus is at 21, almost 22 degrees of Aries, and Pluto is at 18, almost 19 degrees of Capricorn. And so Uranus is moving away from the exact 90-degree angle. And so as it does, things should settle down. But they're not going to. And here's why. The reason is the same reason why the shortest day of the year, the day of the least light, the December 20th or 21st, the winter solstice in the northern hemisphere, that's not the coldest day. Because it takes time for cycles to catch up with what the event is. And we're seeing that right now. The actual imprint of this period of time is said and done and over. And yet we will, for the next weeks, months, and even for the next 2, 3, 4 years, we will see the energy continue to resonate and build in many different ways. Just like the exact conjunction of Uranus and Pluto in the 60s occurred in 1965 and 66. And it wasn't until 67, 68, 69, and even into 70 that the major events happened. It didn't really begin to close down until 71, 72, 73. By the same token, the Uranus-Pluto square was exact in 2012 to 2015, and we're past that, but it keeps getting bumped and resonated by other faster-moving planets as they move around. And right now, this week, we have Mars, again, the god of war, Mars, the planet of assertion and aggression, lining up with Uranus, and just a few, this chart is for the eclipse, the solar eclipse on February 26th. And if we back this up just a couple of days, we can watch that. Whoop, we're doing this by an hour. There we go. If we back this up a couple of days to today, we can see that Mars at 18 degrees is square Pluto at 18 degrees with the moon coming through the picture. So we have this intensity that February ends on, and in a way it sets the tone for March, but March is a bit different. March has a bit of settling energy and a new wave of energy that comes in, and we will look at that and we will get into that now. That was a long prologue, but it was important to do it because we're not getting out of the hole that we've dug over the past 6-8 months. And obviously a lot of that is political, it's economic, it's social, it's cultural. We have our personal counterparts in this because nothing happens on a global scale that in some way isn't reflected individually. So let's bounce ahead to March, which is really what we're supposed to be doing, but you know. All right, so we're moving this ahead now to March 1st, after the eclipse. There we go. And we have on March 1st an interesting aspect that sets the tone for the month. The Sun at 11 degrees of Pisces lines up with Neptune at 11 degrees of Pisces. Now, with the slower moving planets, the Sun that goes around the zodiac once a year from Earth's point of view, the Sun lines up with each of these slower moving planets for about 1 day every year. And so on March 1st, the Sun, which is the light, it's like the central filament of the light of our local system. The Sun lines up with Neptune, and Neptune is the planet of dreams and illusions and fantasies and delusions. Because what's the difference between an illusion and a delusion? What's the difference between spirituality and fantasy? What's the difference between creative imagination, and crazy. There is a difference, but it's a fine line that's a movable line. And if you just look in your own lives, at your own, let's say, spiritual or religious belief, and you look at your religious beliefs of when you were 12 or 15 years old, and then you compare it with when you were 30 or when you were 50 or when you were 60, and you see that what you thought was truth at one point in your life, you look back at and say, that was crazy. But you see, this is what Neptune is. Neptune is our imagination, it's our dreams. And it's important here to understand that dreams or illusions are not untrue. In other words, just because something is a fantasy doesn't mean that it's untrue. What do I mean by that? William Blake wrote, "What is now proved was once only imagined." You know, people used to dream of flying, and that was crazy. You know, and now in 20 hours we fly from India to the United States. What was once imagined is now true. Now that doesn't mean that everything that you imagine becomes true, but my friend Caroline Casey, a very creative astrologer, she calls herself a visionary activist. Caroline says that imagination lays the tracks for the reality train to follow. So we have to be careful about writing off imagination or fantasy as untrue. And what remains illusion, what remains a dream, and what becomes real is only revealed through time. On March 1st, however, with the Sun lined up with Neptune, and these transits we feel coming for a day or two, and we feel kind of lingering for a day or two. But the Sun shines its light on our subconscious dreams, wishes, imagination, illusions, delusions. The old astrology books caution not to sign contracts with a Neptune or to make a business deal with a strong Neptune aspect. Why? Because things are not as they appear. But it's an incredibly powerful, fantastic day to do journeying, to do dreaming, to do ritual, to write poetry, to dream, to write songs, to listen to music, to go to a movie, to read a book. Do you see how we can creatively use this energy? But we have to be careful, because what we're dreaming and what we're imagining isn't necessarily real. But if we put intention behind it, that then becomes the seed for what unfolds over the weeks ahead. The other thing that happens at the beginning of the month is that Jupiter, which is over here, the thing that kind of looks like a 4 almost, Jupiter, the symbol of Jupiter is really interesting because it's the cross. Can you see the cross part in Jupiter? And you see the part that's curving on the left? The symbol represents the waxing moon, the growing moon, which indicates prosperity, rising in the east. All these symbols have stories, but Jupiter is Latin for Jove, which is Greek. And Jove is the word that we use to say someone is happy. They're jovial. Jove is uplifting. Jupiter is optimistic. Jupiter is expansive. Jupiter is big. It's jolly. Santa Claus is a jovial, Jupiterian, fat, expansive character that has this jolliness, this largesse. Jupiter is the biggest of all the planets. So Jupiter moves relatively slowly compared to the Sun, Mercury, Venus, Mars, and the Moon. It takes about 12 years for Jupiter to go all the way around once, and it's what's called a social planet, meaning that Jupiter's movement is less about what I feel than how I relate to the larger environment in which I live. Jupiter is expansive. It brings us out of ourselves and into the social world. Now, Jupiter is in Libra for this year. It's a whole year in a sign, and Libra is the sign of relationships. Jupiter in Libra reminds us of the opportunities that come to us through relationships. However, Jupiter also can make things look better than they really are. It's like a magnifying glass. Looks good, but we may realize that in a year what we thought looked good may not be quite as good. Now, what's going on right now, and this is a pattern throughout 2017, it began last fall, and I'll give you some dates here in a few minutes, but Jupiter at 22 degrees at the beginning of the month, it's actually exact on March 2nd, Jupiter at 22 degrees is opposite Uranus at 22 degrees, Aries to Libra. Aries is the sign of me, of I, of creation. Creation begins with self. Jupiter in Libra, Libra is the sign of relationship. Jupiter is the magnifying lens. Uranus is the planet of shock and surprise and revolution. When Jupiter and Uranus hook up, we're often amazed by what happens because it's Uranian. What does that mean? Unexpected. Expect the unexpected. I mean, even people who were for Trump didn't expect him to win. And so we have this Jupiter kind of expanding, making it bigger, that sense of Uranus, that whole unexpected. And Jupiter lined up opposite Uranus last December for the first time. And because the Earth is moving around and these planets are way out, they look like they move back and forth. This is retrograde, like Mercury retrograde. Like Venus retrograde, which we're going to get to in a moment. Oh, what did I do? Thank you. So it's important to understand that these planetary alignments, like Jupiter opposite Uranus, don't just happen once on one day, like the sun lining up with Neptune for one day every year. Instead, Jupiter lined up with Uranus last December. It lines up with Uranus again the beginning of March, and then for a third and final time, it lines up opposite, Jupiter lines up opposite Uranus again the end of September. So pretty much all of 2017 has this feeling of like being thrust into the future. Uranus is futuristic. Jupiter can be too much. You know, too much change isn't necessarily good. And I'm not judging, well, I am, but I won't right now. I'm not judging good or bad. I'm just noting that the planetary imagery of Jupiter and Uranus is sudden change that can be too much. And because it's in opposition from the sign of me to the sign of environment, Libra, it's very much environmentally oriented. So it has that whole depersonalized aspect as to things that are out of our control. Now, as Jupiter is moving opposite to Uranus, it's also, during this time, moving square to Pluto. Remember, we're coming off of this Uranus square Pluto that was exact from 2012 to 2015. This week, Mars is coming through that and kind of exploding it and making shit happen. But on a slower level, Jupiter squared Pluto and then opposed Uranus, and that was back in November and December of 2016. Then Jupiter turned retrograde, and it's now opposite Uranus now at the beginning of March, but by the end of March, because Jupiter's now moving apparently backwards, by the end of March it'll be squaring Pluto for the second time. And then Jupiter turns around, goes direct for the third and final time, and it connects with the square to Pluto in the beginning of August and the opposition to Uranus at the end of September. So here's the deal. Jupiter is the magnifying lens. Jupiter is the planet of bigger and better and more. It's like the cosmic amplifier. Jupiter is the only planet in the entire solar system that gives off more radiation than it receives from the sun. It's an incredible radio source. And in fact, from the distance, our solar system might look a little like a binary star system, with Jupiter being the second star. It's big enough, its mass is large enough that it actually bends the gravitational field of the sun out of shape. So, March has this incredible pattern through the month of, again, this planet of bigger, better, more, too much, opposite the planet of crazy. That's Uranus. And squaring the planet of Pluto. Now, you probably have heard the word plutocracy, which is a government by the very wealthy. There's a new word, or another word that's used more now. Bernie used it all the time, I can't remember. An oligarchy. So an oligarchy is basically similar to a plutocracy. Pluto is the planet of immeasurable wealth. Pluto is the lord of the underworld. Okay, in ancient times, the underworld was not only the unconscious and the hell realms, the place where you go in the Christian mythology to get punished, but in William Blake's mythology, he said hell was a place so beautiful it would torment an angel to insanity. Because you see, Pluto is the place of transformation. Pluto is the reminder that at the end, Saturn is the end. We can't see any further out than Saturn without a telescope until we go to the stars. When we discovered Pluto, our consciousness basically came to grips with the fact that when it ends, Saturn, life ends. Saturn is Father Time. Saturn is Kronos. Saturn is the Grim Reaper. When it ends, Pluto says, it doesn't really end. This is Pluto's job. At the moment of death, whether it's our physical death, or every year when the sun moves into Scorpio and the leaves fall off the trees, and Scorpio being associated with that transformation that occurs after death and before rebirth, that's after the obvious stuff is no longer visible and before the sun moves into Aries at the first moment of spring, which it does every year in March at the spring equinox, at the vernal equinox. We'll get there in just a moment. But the thing about Pluto is that Pluto is underground. It's stuff that's hidden. It's our unconscious. The hell realms are those things which we cannot experience up here. We suppress them, we deny them, they're terrible, we push them away. We're fearful of them. But that which is hidden has more power over us than that which is brought into awareness. And so the thing about Pluto is that in ancient times, underground was also where the metals were, and this was wealth. He who had gold and silver and copper and iron and tin was wealthy. And so this idea of a plutocracy is a government by those who have hidden wealth. And here we are. Jupiter is not only opposite Uranus, but it's in conflict. It's in dynamic square to Pluto, bringing this stuff out into the open. And once you see it, you can't make it go away. And this is where we are on the bigger scheme of things. You know, as horrific as some of the things that are going on politically right now, there may be a hidden silver lining in the black cloud that may just get people moving in ways that they didn't think they had to until they realized it could all be taken away rather quickly. Not going to go down that rabbit hole real deeply today because we've been there before, and I'll be there again, I promise. All right, but I'm trying to set up the power of this month. With Jupiter, well, with the end of February, with Mars lining up with Uranus, squaring Pluto and lining up with Uranus. Now it looks like Venus is coming into this mix, but Venus right now is as bright in the sky as she ever gets. Anyone seen her recently? In the evening sky, once the sun goes down and you look up and you see that airplane that doesn't move, must be a weather balloon. It's Venus. She don't like being called a weather balloon. Venus, the goddess of love. Venus, the beautiful planet, the planet of attraction and desire. And when Venus goes around the sun, from Earth's point of view, when she gets far away from the sun, she kind of has to stop and then come around on the inside. In other words, we're here on Earth, but Venus is going around the sun. And if we map Venus, let's say the microphone is the sun, and Venus is going around the sun, from our point of view, it looks like she's going like this. You see that? And so Venus, like Mercury, turns retrograde. Mercury turns retrograde 3 times a year for 3 weeks, and so it always seems like, oh crap, another Mercury retrograde? All right. And those of you who have heard me talk before, you know that I am very strongly down on the superstition that Mercury retrograde is bad. Planets aren't good or bad. Some are more difficult to work with than others. But there's nothing bad about a Mercury retrograde. What it really means, when any planet is retrograde, it's closer to Earth. I've said this before from on this stage, and I'll say it again. We've all had the experience of being in a subway or in a train and seeing a train on the distant side of the valley against the mountains, and it's a freight train, and so we're going faster than it, but we can see it moving against the mountains. But then as these two tracks come closer and closer together, and all of a sudden it's on the track right next to us, we look out the window and we're sure it's going backwards. You've had that experience perhaps in a car, you know, where you're rolling forward just a touch and it looks like the car next to you is going backwards. Especially in subways where you're passing another train, it looks like it's going backwards. That's all retrograde is. But a retrograde planet is a planet that's closer to Earth. So it's louder, which sounds good, except too loud ain't good. And if you don't believe me, how do we treat hyperactive children? We give them an amphetamine-based Ritalin or some damn drug that makes them so hyperactive they shut down. Do you understand that mechanism? And that's what a retrograde planet is. It shuts down because it's too much. It's too loud. And so the deal is, rather than fearing the retrograde planet, is we need to work with them. We need to work with the energy because we have an opportunity to use the planetary energy even more. So, Mercury turns retrograde 3 times a year for 3 weeks at a shot. Venus turns retrograde once every other year. It's really about every year and a half. And it turns retrograde for about 40 days. 40 days and 40 nights. All right, Venus retrogrades for 40 days. Venus actually is moving very slowly now because she's far away from the sun from Earth's perspective, which is why she looks so beautiful and bright in the sky. So Venus actually turns retrograde on March 4th. So we have, let's just look at Venus here for a moment. Here's Venus right now at 13 degrees of Aries. I'm going to back this up. I just want you to look at only Venus here. There's going to be a lot of other noise and movement, but you're watching this guy, right? This guy, this gal, this woman, this goddess, Venus, this goddess. And so we're backing this up, and here you can see that on February 2nd, Venus moved from Pisces into Aries. See that? On February 2nd. So through most of February, Venus has been in Aries, and Venus isn't thrilled about Aries, but she tends to make the most of it. I mean, Venus is soft and loving and sweet and desirous, and Aries is fast and hot. Aries is the sign that goes along with Mars, not Venus. Now, Venus and Mars have a special relationship in mythology. They're the cosmic lovers. You know, Venus is the feminine energy, and I don't mean specifically what sex organs you happen to be wearing this lifetime, but Venus is the feminine energy, the yin, if you will, and Mars is the masculine energy, the yang. And Venus and Mars represent a polarity. Mars is in Aries now also. And Mars is strong and powerful and at home in Aries. He's fiery and feisty and carrying knives and guns and is loudmouthed and assertive and maybe even aggressive. This is Mars in Aries. This is part of what's going on right now. And Mars also moved into Aries back the end of January. But because Venus normally moves much faster than Mars, but because she's been moving closer toward her retrograde, she's moving slower now. So Venus and Mars have been tracking together all through February and March, or all through February and now through the beginning of March. So normally it takes Venus about 6 weeks to go through a sign. However, Venus is going to be camped out in Aries forever. Why? Watch this. Here we are in February. Now, Venus is moving slower now, and so we do this a day at a time and bring this all the way through February, and Venus is barely halfway through Aries, through an entire month. And now Venus hit 12 degrees of Aries. 12 degrees of Aries on February 23rd. And look, it stays at 12 degrees of Aries. It moves to 13 degrees, barely. Then it turns retrograde. It stays at 13, and it moves back through 12 all the way through the middle of March. Do you see how it's holding its position? Because like a pendulum changing direction, when a planet goes retrograde, it has to slow down, stop, and then move forward, and then it gains speed, and it's at its fastest halfway through its cycle. So what this means is that Venus is retrograde all the way through March. In fact, Venus stays retrograde all the way through April 15th, tax day. Great. But as Venus is moving through Aries and it turns retrograde, on April 2nd, and we'll talk more about this next month, Venus actually backs out of Aries and does like a little revisit back into Pisces before she turns direct and moves back into Aries again for another 6 weeks. So this Venus thing is incredibly important. Why? Because it's kind of like, when you have a retrograde, you can use what I call the re-words. Review, rework, revisit. There's a sense of Venus is love. Old friends and old loves come back into our lives when Venus turns retrograde. And even if it's not in physical reality, there's a part of us that spends time thinking or dreaming about the past because it's almost like we're returning back to where we were. It's almost like through January, February, it might have felt like we were moving into new territory with our relationship with money. Venus is also money. It's anything of value. It's love and money and desire. And so it might have felt like we were moving into new ground. But now as Venus turns retrograde, it might feel like we're not making the progress that we thought we were or that we expected to. And this can be very frustrating. This is the perceived downside of a retrograde. But there's nothing wrong with it. In fact, it's giving you more time to integrate your feelings and to make the changes that you need to, so that in April, when Venus turns direct again, April and May, then you'll be able to put into motion what you maybe thought you wanted to put in motion back in February, March, but weren't quite ready. So the Venus retrograde is a key part. And I brought this up because, well, if we bring this back to now, or the beginning of March, it looks like Mars, which lined up with which squared Pluto and lined up with Uranus, really kind of creating the sense of immediacy around war, aggression, assertion, the old versus the new, the courts, the judicial system versus the executive, the traditional military versus the indigenous peoples, the rights of individuals versus the suppression by the government. However you want to look at it, this stuff is all in our face right now. It looks like Venus should be following right behind, but because Venus turns retrograde, Venus doesn't hit that Uranus-Pluto square until April, May. So just that, we'll be back to Venus when Venus comes through. But right now we have Mars there, and of course we have Jupiter there all this month. All right, so that's like a really significant piece of what's happening this month. But there are a few other things I want to make sure we cover. Okay. A few key dates. Let's back, we're right there. On March 5th, we have Mars moving through Aries, forming a harmonious and exact trine, that's that big thick blue line with Saturn. Now Mars and Saturn, traditionally in astrology, are not necessarily nice planets. We moderners, again, kind of revision it and say planets aren't either nice or not nice, it's how we handle them. But Mars and Saturn in traditional astrology are called the malefics. They're badass planets. Mars is the god of war, and Saturn is the Grim Reaper, you know? I mean, of course, Saturn is also, if you do hard work, you get good results. And Mars is also the planet that gives us the drive to follow through on what we start. It's just Mars and Saturn are harder to manage. They are the malefics. Compared to Venus and Jupiter, traditionally, they're the benefics. Venus, the planet of love, and Jupiter, the planet of prosperity and optimism. Now again, too much Venus-Jupiter is no good. You know, you get diabetics. You know, because you over-sugar, you overexpand. Venus-Jupiter is overindulgence. So we have to be careful about these good planets, bad planets thing. However, on March 5th, the bad planets of Mars and Saturn make the best possible alignment. When Jeff was alive, Jeff and I used to have this discussion of when good planets do bad things and when bad planets do good things. The question was, if you have any aspect between two planets, even if it's a good aspect, is it still bad news? And it's funny because over a period of 15 years, he and I used to argue about this a lot, and to find that sometimes we had switched and we didn't, you know, we had somehow we're taking, you know, the opposite position that we once had. But here's the deal. Mars says go, Saturn says stop. Mars says yes, Saturn says no. Mars says gas, Saturn says brake. It's not easy to work these energies. However, if we do, we can accomplish an amazing thing. You know, an accomplished race car driver has a functional Mars-Saturn relationship because they can work that gas and brake very efficiently. Most of us idiots hit the gas pedal too hard and then have to hit the brake harder than we need to. Are you with me here? So, when Mars trines Saturn over the next couple of weeks, it's indicative of a time when we have tremendous skill and capability to manage the yes-no in our lives. It's organizational skills. It's the ability to follow through and make something happen that's real without burning out and doing too much too fast. Because that balance between hot Mars and cold Saturn is amplified when they make such an easy aspect. The trine is a flowing, is a superconductive energy. All right, so that's March 5th. The next thing that we have that's significant is Mars is nearing the end of Aries. And Mars by by March 10th, actually it's late on the 9th, Mars leaves Aries and enters Taurus. And I have to say, he's not happy. Why? Because Mars in Aries is like a king in his castle. Aries is Mars' sign, and Mars is hot and fiery, and Aries says, go for it, dude. But in Taurus, Taurus is a subdued energy. It's determined, and it's slower. And so Mars needs to cool his jets in order to accomplish. Now Mars can be much more effective in Taurus than in Aries, but it's harder, and once Mars moves into Taurus around March 10th, we may actually begin to look at projects in a different way, and rather than trying to get everything done now, we begin to plan, and we're more methodical, because Taurus of all the signs is the most methodical, it's the most determined. Okay, so that's March 10th. Then we come up to the full moon on March 12th. And this is a full moon in Virgo because the sun is in Pisces still. The sun is in Pisces until the spring equinox on March 20th. And so here we have the new moon. The new moon is the full moon is actually at 7:53 a.m. Pacific time. So that's 10:53 a.m. Eastern time on March 12th. The moon in Virgo wants us to focus our energy. We need to detail, to see the leaves rather than the forest. And so the moon in Virgo says, analyze and go for the detail. But the full moon is opposite the sun in Pisces, and Pisces says, what's a detail? Pisces says, dissolve into the greater whole. Remember, it's Neptune in Pisces even, and that's the dreams and the imagination. The thing about dreams is that there's no boundaries. Pisces has no boundaries. If you know Pisces people, they're more dreamy, they're intuitive, they're spiritual. They have a harder time often in establishing strong boundaries than, let's say, a Capricorn, which is Saturn related, and Saturn is amazing at making boundaries, sometimes too good. So this full moon, in a way, is a study between the need to focus our energy and the need to dream. And also this full moon, the sun is lined up with Chiron, and Chiron is the wounded healer. Chiron is, the mythology of Chiron is, it's the part of each and every one of us that's human, that all the sex, drugs, rock and roll, love, meditation, yoga, psychedelics, and religion ain't gonna fix. You know, we're human, and we have our wounds. And in a way, with the sun lined up with Chiron during this full moon, there's an awareness of our limitations. And all I can say is that during this full moon period, the most important thing is to be gentle with yourselves, because we're all human. All right, so we move on past this full moon, and on March 13th, the following day, let's go back to a day at a time, from an hour at a time. And the following day, we have Mercury moving from Pisces into Aries. So we're getting a thrust here. Remember, Pisces is dreamy and illusory and elusive and soft and kind of like Angora. It's like, you know, there's not a lot of boundary. It's just soft. Pisces is the sign of belief. It's the sign of spirituality also. But as the planets move from Pisces into Aries, in this case Mercury, our minds all of a sudden become very sharp. So March 14th, 15th, Mercury moves into Aries. Actually, the afternoon of the 13th, And if you're paying attention, you'll be able to actually feel it. Why? Because it's like the mind all of a sudden has direction. Aries has direction. There's that sense of asserting oneself intellectually, mentally. And so Mercury enters Aries. Venus is already in Aries. Uranus has been in Aries for 6 years, and it'll be there until the end of 2017. So we have a definite Aries flavor developing. But over the following week, we have first the Sun at the end of Pisces, moving first when it hits 27 degrees of Pisces, 3 days before the first day of spring. It forms an exact square with Saturn. Now remember, Saturn says no. Saturn says breaks. The Sun is our light. It's our awareness. And so when the Sun squares Saturn, this is a square, not a trine. This is a conflict. We may feel like we've run into a wall. We may have total frustration for a day because something that we've been working on isn't working. There's a sense of maybe we doubt ourselves and think that decisions we make weren't the right ones. So this Sun square Saturn on March 17th can be very difficult. But we recover from it quickly because just a couple of days later, on the 20th, the Sun moves into Aries, and this is the first moment of spring. This is actually the astrological new year. It's not on January 1st. Aries is the beginning of every cycle, the beginning of spring, and when the Sun moves into Aries, that's when the action starts. I hear you thinking, wait a minute, haven't we had enough action already? But we would definitely get a bump, and we feel it personally. This is spring fever. It's feeling excited, feeling enthusiastic. The word enthusiasm actually comes from Greek, entheos, theology. Enthusiasm means entheos, it means with God. And when there's no ego in the way, we have no reason to hold back because we are at one with the universe. Now that's an ideal situation, obviously, but it is the origins of the word enthusiasm. So, starting around March 20th, we have the Sun, we have Venus, and we have Mercury and Uranus all clustered in Aries. And boy, the energy level is going to pick up. Lots of stuff's going to happen, and things are going to really start moving forward, whatever that means. Now, by the 23rd, Mercury now hits the same spot that Mars and Jupiter have been in. In other words, by the 23rd, Mercury hits the square point to Pluto, and by the 26th, it lines up with Uranus. Can you see that? Excuse me. Now remember, Rick's axiom. Every time a planet runs through the conjunction, square, or opposition to the now fading Uranus-Pluto square that was exact from 2012 to 2015, every time another planet runs through those points, the shit's going to go all over again. And so we can look at the end of March with Mercury from the it'll really begin on the first day of spring around the 20th, but from the 23rd through the 26th, Mercury is back in the equation. And we're coming toward an Aries new moon. Watch the moon here, day by day. There's the moon in Pisces. A day later, it's in Aries. And the following day, and we'll back this up a few hours at a time, and there is the moon lined up with the Sun. And the exact new moon is on March 27th at 7:57 p.m. That's Pacific time. That's 10:57 p.m. Eastern time. And this new moon is like the first day of the year on steroids. Because remember, the first day of spring is really like the beginning of the astrological year, but when we have a new moon, that's the beginning of a new cycle. Every new moon is the beginning of a new cycle. And so the new moon in Aries is like the beginning of the cycle of Aries. So it's almost like the first week of spring is getting us ready for the real oomph that's going to happen between March 20th and March 27th. By March 29th, Mercury hits that trine point where Mars was earlier in the month on the 5th. And do you remember, let me just get that there. Oh, let's go back to a day at a time, 1 hour, 1 day. And so now we have Mercury at 27 Aries and Saturn at 27 Sagittarius. Do you remember back on the 5th when we had Mars trining Saturn? And I said, does anybody remember what that was? Mars is the planet of what?
Gas pedal.
Gas pedal, and Saturn is
The brake.
the brake. And with the trine, what was their relationship?
Harmonious.
They're harmonious. They were working well together. Well, now Mars is off in Taurus, kind of not worrying so much about the gas pedal, taking a leisurely drive through the country, because that's what Mars in Taurus likes to do. It drives towards pleasure rather than a destination, because Taurus is Venus related. It's pleasurable. It's sensual. I don't mean sexual. I mean of the senses. But now Mercury is harmonizing with Saturn. What's Mercury? The planet of communication. So what's the relationship now between communication? We could say it's the brake, but it's also the wall. What is a wall? It's structure. It's laws. Saturn is authority. Saturn is your parents when you're young, the cops when you're older. Saturn is the rules of science and nature and society. And so when Mercury, the planet of the mind, is working harmoniously with the rules, what might you think?
Politics will get more positive?
Maybe. Whether it gets more see, we have to be careful with the positive negative, but intellect becomes real. Things are communicated in a way that is more real. Saturn is also karmic. Saturn says you get what you deserve. That's why the Grim Reaper says that when you die, you go to hell, because most of us deserve shit. Well, you know, I say that tongue-in-cheek, but we come from a religious tradition where we are born of original sin, and therefore it's something to overcome. And at the end, karma is not on our side, so to speak. Now, I'm not saying I believe that, I'm just saying that is certainly a thought out there. So when Mercury is trine Saturn, it may be that some facts, Mercury, come out that are inarguably real. It may be that some laws or structures are created that are more solid than before. And again, whether it works in our favor or not, there's no way of knowing, but we know energetically what it is that will happen. Are you with me here? So how do we use that? Well, if you had a letter to write to an authority or to your boss, or if you had a meeting in which you wanted to unveil a new plan for the structure of your department, do it on that day. Do you see how we can make use of this energy? Because on that day, give or take a day or two on either side, you have the structure of Saturn working well with the intellect. The thoughts that we have when Mercury trines Saturn are most likely real ones, as opposed to the ones that we have on March 1st, when the Sun is lining up with illusory Neptune. We can count on those thoughts as being imaginative, creative. Not wrong, but you see, now we have those thoughts that we had on March 1st, those dreams that we created intentions around. It's on March 29th, that's the day to make it real. And obviously it's not just you leave it and you just come back to it on that day, but if you're making a plan, make your plan culminate on that day when something real can happen. Then on March 30th, we end the month with Jupiter squaring Pluto. We talked about that at the beginning, that Jupiter square Pluto is part of that Jupiter thing that I said was involved all month. And again, I think we can look at some very large-scale stuff coming out in the open, Pluto the hidden, Jupiter the expansive, and again, that Jupiter-Pluto square began back around Thanksgiving, back in November of last year, and the second phase of that is at the end of March. The third phase will be the beginning of August. But I think here we're looking at some very deep processing, and I think that anyone who does ritual on a regular basis, as we move closer toward the end of the month, especially making use of the Mercury trine Saturn and that Jupiter square Pluto, we can do some serious magic in overthrowing power that is dark. Because Pluto can be dark. See, Pluto's dark, Jupiter's light. And again, too much light is not necessarily good, it's blinding. But we have an opportunity here through March, of actually making some interesting stuff happen and bringing stuff out into the light. On March 31st, and we will actually meet here again on Wednesday night, March 29th, on the day of the Mercury trine Saturn. So next month's astrology night, I'll probably be not as funny, not that I was funny tonight, but I'll be probably rather serious and probably say things that are more important than I'm saying now too. Just because I'll be working on that Mercury-Saturn trine, but I'll also be working on the Jupiter square Pluto, so we'll probably delve a little deeper. However, the other thing that's happening on the very last day of the month is that Mercury, which had been moving through Aries, and remember, Mercury, when it's not retrograde, flies through a sign. It takes about 2.5 weeks to go through a sign. And so Mercury entered, where'd it go? Mercury entered Aries on March 13th, and 2 weeks later, on March 31st, it enters Taurus. And so by the end of March, even though the sun is still in mid-Aries, we're beginning to get a flavor. And I would suggest that we might have an earlier spring than usual. Why? Because 2 of the 3 planets that often stick close to the sun, Mars and Mercury, will be ahead of the sun and on into the next sign. So we might have early blooms and more warmth. And there's a whole branch of astrology that's weather astrology. I do the whether or not astrology. And I'm not a weather astrologer, but I know that when these planets are far ahead of the sun, often the next season seems to come a little bit earlier. Now that'll be kind of a little tricky because we also have Venus behind the sun, and so there'll be a little bit of turmoil weather-wise in there. But I'm less interested, quite frankly, in the weather than I am in the fact that when Mercury moves into Taurus, that again, our fast-moving thoughts, our mind that has a destination and we're looking for the shortest distance to it, that's Aries, the gas pedal, get me there now. All of a sudden we become less urgent. We become more willing to take the route that will get us there safely rather than the route that'll get us there now. So, pulling back and just kind of taking a look at the whole month ahead, it's an interesting month because it really is capped by Jupiter and Mars and Mercury rattling this ongoing, now receding, now waning Uranus-Pluto square, and yet we're not done with it. And so I'm still here saying that the shit ain't over. Now, obviously, you don't have to be an astrologer to know that. You just need to, watch a news station for 5 minutes and go, oh my God, where am I? Oz? Maybe. But March will have a lot of that energy wrapped up in it again, and yet it'll also be, I wanted to say flavored, but what came into my mind was tainted. But I don't really mean that, but flavored, maybe I do, flavored by the Venus retrograde, because Venus doesn't turn direct, until mid-April. And so almost all of this month, the nice things, Venus, seem perhaps just a little out of reach. Or maybe it's so much that we can't incorporate it and assimilate it. Again, it's tricky trying to turn these images into individual stories, because we're all individually so different as to how we handle these different energies. That's it. It's going to be quite a rock and roll month, and I think that in some ways March begins today. I mean, today being February 22nd, because we have that Mars, squaring Pluto today, and this incredible power showdown unfolding at Standing Rock that will culminate this weekend on the 26th, when Mars lines up with revolutionary Uranus, and we're in for another round of shock surprise at whatever happens then, and the eclipse. And remember, our, I was going to say fearless leader, but I'm actually going to say our fearful leader, was born under an eclipse and may be particularly susceptible to the powerful changes and the sudden changes that often happen at eclipses. So we'll be here next month and see what happens and watch it all unfold. And thank you all for your indulgence once again.